All right, everyone. God kväll. Good evening. My name is Björn. I have the privilege of introducing tonight's guest. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a cognitive scientist, and I work here upstairs. Now, it's good because you don't need to be a philosopher to join Filosofiska Föreningen, the Philosophical Society. It costs only 20 crowns. It's so little. And it's voluntary. You don't even have to pay to be here, but you are free to sign up to get all the interesting information about the lecturers that are coming here. So please do. We have a head of organization there, Fritz, who can take your interest. So what to say about tonight's guest? Lots of things, I think, there is to say, but I first met Alexander at the scientific conference a few years ago, and I think we just had a discussion actually about the relationship between philosophy and science here. Alexander might explain that to you. This is, of course, not truly a scientific setting. It's more like a meta-science or maybe even an art. Yes. Alexander Bard's background as an academic is more, well, you have a training as an economist. You are a member of staff of Stockholm School of Economics. You are an author. Show that already. I think it's like 703 pages over the last.
That's 3
years.
books in one.
It's 3 books in one. The Futurika trilogy, the Turika trilogy. What else? What impresses me about your philosophy is the fact that you don't only talk about old Greeks or old geeks, maybe. You actually produce new thoughts and quite provocative thoughts. You have a focus on the future, and you're actually able to predict things in several ways, which makes me very curious to hear what you have to say tonight. What else? Well, you are a sharp thinker. You are an intellectual. You are also a prolific spokesman, I would say, of civil liberties and human rights. And just like the rest of you, I'm very curious on what you have to say tonight, so I'm not going to be very wordy. I'd just like to welcome Alexander Bard and a warm applause for him.
Thank you all for showing up tonight. I'm terribly grateful that so many of you showed up, since I'm not going to run an idle jury from here. So I have 2 careers, as you probably know. One of them is quite public. And the other one, which is where my heart really is not so public at all. Philosophy is really an art form for nerds. And I'm one of them, definitely. The question is, why do you do philosophy to begin with? Well, you read Nietzsche when you're 7, you read Hegel when you're 8, you read Kant when you're 9, and then you finish by you're 10. You don't study it. If you study philosophy, at best you become a philosophy teacher. If you're going to do philosophy, you actually have to know it by heart already by the age of 10. It's a bit like art in that sense. And when we discussed, Björn and I discussed before while having coffee what philosophy really is, I have 2 descriptions. Number one is that philosophy is an art form. It's a literary art form. It's not a science. Science is a small world. Philosophy is far, far bigger. That means when you do science, you practice something called philosophy of science. Philosophy has a lot to say about science. Science has nothing to say about philosophy whatsoever. As a philosopher, you're also allowed to be speculative. Actually, philosophy is a speculative art. You're supposed to speculate. When people say that you're just an armchair philosopher, that's what a philosopher is supposed to be. You're supposed to sit in an armchair and speculate. That's what philosophers do. Scientists, though, they're only allowed to say things if they can back them up with empirical facts. So you present a hypothesis, and then you're supposed to present the facts to strengthen your argument. As a philosopher, I don't need to have any empirical facts whatsoever. I just like to have empirical facts to strengthen my arguments, my books anyway, just to strengthen the arguments. But as a philosopher, I don't really have to. The best description of what philosophy is in a contemporary sense is, my favorite quote is from Gilles Deleuze. And he says that philosophy is the art of inventing concepts to understand the world better. And the reason I do philosophy professionally is that I really started out, I was hired by the Stockholm School of Economics in 1998 as an internet sociologist. Probably the first internet social theorist in the world at the time. Not the only one now, though, but at the time, probably the first. But I discovered early on that the internet is such a huge new phenomenon that it can only be described if we use new concepts. And the same second you move from using old concepts into inventing new concepts, you go from sociology to philosophy. So even if I loved philosophy, I never really planned to become a philosopher. I just had to. Some countries, they call me cyber philosopher. You can use any prefix you like. That's fine with me. But what I do is actually philosophy proper. I invent new concepts to understand the world better. I'm the opposite of a poet. A poet is there to confuse you, to make the world more ambivalent, to invent new words just for the hell of it, to make the world more interesting than it really is. And a philosopher goes in the opposite direction. A philosopher is a person who is really frustrated with the world being so complicated and tries to explain how it actually works and tries to combine things and put them into context and give them meaning. So philosophers do a lot of work that later artists and scientists can use. If they're really good, they're actually ahead of everybody else. Like I used to say, there wouldn't have been an Albert Einstein without the Friedrich Nietzsche first. There you go. So I've written 3 books so far with Jan Söderqvist. The first one was called The Netocrats and came out 13 years ago. It was a sort of primary work on internet social theory. I have no idea what my publishers in the UK and the US did, but they managed to fool people into believing it was a Scandinavian crime novel or something, because it sold over 340,000 copies, which is unheard of for a work of philosophy. A lot of those people must have bought that book, started reading it, and then after three pages realized they didn't get it. You know? But I was kind of disappointed that it sold so well, so I decided to write a book just to show off how smart I am. And that was the second book, called The Global Empire. And unless you're really, really clever and you already know his philosophy really well, don't read it. It's that difficult. It's the kind of book that only 500 people on the planet are supposed to understand. But it's, of course, the book you write to show you're smart, and it's, of course, the book that other philosophers love to quote. And it established me as a philosopher. I think my break, because philosophy, just like art, is a discursive phenomenon today. You become a philosopher by being recognized as a philosopher by other philosophers. Art is the same way. You become an artist because other artists say you're an artist. Unless they do so, you're not an artist, you're just a joke. So it's a discursive phenomenon. It's self-repeating. And in 2004, Slavoj Žižek released a book called Organs, Blood, Bodies, and devoted a whole chapter in the book to Barton Söderqvist. And after that, everybody's mouth was shut up in Sweden. Everybody realized I was really a philosopher, because other philosophers treated me like one. And to be honest, I'm quite proud to say that there's a whole new generation of Swedish philosophers now breaking internationally. You've probably heard about Martin Hägglund. He's this young genius who took his PhD at Harvard. He's now a professor at Yale. And he wrote an amazing book on Derrida a couple of years ago called Radical Atheism, which gave him a big break in the States. And a close friend of mine is Carl Cederström, probably Simon Critchley's favorite disciple, another Swedish guy, who actually just got a post at the University of Stockholm, believe it or not. And he's going to leave Cardiff, where he is right now, and relocate to Stockholm. He just came out with his first book, which is amazing too. And then, of course, you got the wonderful Swedish transhumanists, Nick Bostrom and Anders Sandberg, both at Oxford. They're at Oxford and Cambridge, who I also definitely count among the really smart, clever new minds in Europe at the moment. So there's a lot of things going on. Finally, Sweden, which has this complex when it comes to philosophy, is delivering philosophers. Unheard of before. But it's fun. Anyway, we wrote The Netocrats, we wrote The Global Empire. The third book is called The Body Machines. And together they constitute the Futurica trilogy, which was released in the States earlier this year as a combined trilogy. That was the original plan. When I met Jan Söderqvist in 1998, the first evening we met, we decided to work together and write 3 books right away. Because our plans and our ideas were completely coordinated from the very beginning. And we decided to write a book on technology, a book on the new worldview that the internet is bringing, and then a book on the new idea what it means to be human. Because we believe the internet is such a huge revolution that actually everything, when it comes to worldview and idea what it means to be human, will change profoundly. That's why you have these 3 books. The opening chapter of The Netocrats, it is literally called Technology is the Motor of History. And we set out the foundation for our work there, which is that the human being is a constant. We haven't really changed over the last 100,000 years. Genetically, we are about the same as we were 100,000 years ago. Actually, we use a smaller part of our brain now than we did 5,000 years ago. So if anything, we're becoming more stupid. That's what I learned from Michel Foucault, by the way. People are getting more and more stupid, not more and more intelligent. Then if that's the constant, the variable in human history is technology. The only thing that really has changed over the last 5,000 years when civilization was created is technology. So if we change our thinking, it's due to technology. That is a radical new idea. It hasn't really been proposed before. It's kind of proto-Nietzschean. Nietzsche would have said something like that if he'd lived today. But I think that also made our work take off because we moved philosophy in a brand new direction by doing that. So those were the 3 books. And actually, I was pretty fine with that 3 years ago. We released The Body Machines. We worked hard on these books. And Söderqvist and I traveled all around the world to Taiwan, India, South Africa, Brazil, America, giving lectures everywhere. And because the internet is swallowing everything, you end up giving speeches at the World Conference for City Planning and things like that. Because every city in the world has to be redrawn and rebuilt. People are not going to go to work for 5 days a week in the future. They're not even going to work 5 days a week now. They're going to work on average 3.5 days a week now. So every city in the world has to be rebuilt. The world has to change, and it will change. It will change dramatically because of technological development. But about 3 years ago, if you'd asked me, I'd probably said, well, I've written those 3 books, I'm fine with that. I'll do something fun now for the rest of my life. I'll just skip this. I've done my job. Then about a year ago, I ran into this idea called synthesis. And synthesis is an idea that was originally developed at Burning Man. Have you heard about Burning Man? Burning Man, you can Google it. Burning Man is a huge festival that takes place in September every year, when about 60,000 people go into the deserts of northern Nevada, and they set up a temporary city for about 8 days. And after 8 days, they leave and they don't leave a trace in the desert. So they just go there. 60,000 people set up a city for 8 days, and then they leave. And during those 8 days, they practice a temporary utopia. You're not allowed to exchange any sort of money whatsoever. You're not allowed to trade anything. You're only allowed to give. To give out of a willingness to give. For no reason at all, except that you want to give. This is a perfect example of the attempt to recreate utopia in our age. I completely agree with Slavoj Žižek and Simon Critchley that a really, really dangerous thing with our age is the fact that this is the first time in human history we don't believe in utopia. We are in an extremely cynical age right now. And that is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. I don't think human life on the planet will be saved at all. I think the scaremongering among ecologists is absolutely sound. Because we don't have any mechanism now to stop ourselves from destroying the planet. There's no such mechanism whatsoever. In that sense, the Marx is absolutely right. Capitalism is eventually going to destroy the planet. It doesn't have any built-in mechanism that will prevent you from doing that. So I'm not a liberal. I'm not liberal. I do not believe in liberalism at all. And I think the fact that we don't have utopia right now is incredibly dangerous. But what I've tried to do is to look at maybe people through their behavior, because behavior precedes thought. We behave in a certain manner first, and then we think about it afterwards. That's neuroscience, by the way. If philosophers tell you anything different, they haven't studied neuroscience, but they should. And then I discovered utopia actually does exist. The dream of utopia does exist. It exists at least as temporary utopias. I'm studying eco-villages around Europe at the moment for the new book, because that's another perfect example of temporary utopias being set up, and I found it incredibly interesting. But I was at Burning Man anyway. And I met this Canadian actress at Burning Man when I was there 3 years ago, and she told me about this idea about synthesis. And the synthesis idea is essentially that when 60,000 people gather in the deserts of northern Nevada from all over the world to create a temporary utopia for 8 days, where they practice a completely different form of life than they would anywhere else, that really constitutes a religious movement. And at the end of the Burning Man week, on the Saturday night, they're burning a huge man, the Burning Man. They build the man, it's like tall like a skyscraper, and he's burned. And then 25,000 people are standing in the desert, and they're applauding, and they're singing, and they're making music, and they're doing all kinds of wonderful things. And it's just like going to Mecca. It's like practicing Hajj. And that's exactly what you told me. And she said there are some people at Burning Man who think of this really as a religious movement. And it has a name. It's called synthesis. And synthism, nobody knows who came up with the word, but it's really derived from Greek. It's syn and theos. Syn meaning created, and theos meaning God. And I started to dig into this idea, and I discovered this was obviously an idea that other philosophers that contemporary would be had jumped onto as well. And two of the most interesting ones that I then started studying is a really controversial French philosopher named Quentin Melasson. He's a big name at the moment in France. He's the main disciple of Alain Badiou, who you probably heard about. And then there's, of course, the big British giant at the moment, Simon Critchley. And Simon is a friend of mine, and I talked to him, and he said he was writing a book about this phenomenon. And his book is called The Faith of the Faithless. It came out earlier this year. I strongly recommend you reading it if you're interested in these topics. And in The Faith of the Faithless, Simon Critchley says that, no, I do not agree with Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou that we should all go out of the streets and start a bloody revolution and reinstate a dictator. We tried that, it didn't work. Let's try something different. And what Simon Critchley does in his book is that he proposes what he calls a mystical anarchism. Mystical anarchism. A kind of religion without religion. A faith without faith. A desire for utopia, a desire for faith in itself, in its pure form. I found the idea very interesting and discussed it with Simon, and Simon said, Alexander, you should really write the next book, because if you find the weakness with my work, that would be your book. And I read The Faith of the Faithless, and then Simon and I had another conversation. And he said, well, what am I lacking? And I said, well, number one, you haven't been to Burning Man, and number two, you don't understand what a profound phenomenon the internet is, and the possibilities that the internet then creates. And he said, well, that's your book. So finally, I had an idea for a fourth book. And that's the book I'm working on at the moment in Joel Söderqvist, and I'm actually honored to be here tonight to present the idea to you guys for the first time. So I'm really digging deep into the idea at the moment, what we can do with these ideas, and this is where we're at. And Quentin Melasson's radical idea, there's a wonderful quote from Quentin that I will start with. It's this word that makes us all very uncomfortable, the word God. But Quentin Melasson puts it this way. He is a radical, sort of post-Marxist leftist thinker, okay? And a young genius. And Quentin Melasson says, God is far too important in concept to lead to the religious. And he bases that statement on the idea that if we summarize all the dreams that we all have, as 7 billion human beings on the planet, if we summarize every dream we have, and we throw all these ideas, project them into one single spot, as if it's just one thing, the only name we have for those dreams, combined as one dream, is God. Our language doesn't provide us with any other word. But according to Quentin Melasson, the problem with the concept of God throughout history has been that God is always, he has to be put somewhere. He's given a gender to start with, which is kind of unfortunate, but let's call him just for now. But God has always been put in the past to serve a certain purpose. And that's obviously because in the feudal society, there was a point of putting God in the past, because then God could be a man, and he could have a big penis, and it could be in the sky, and it could be the ultimate father of all fathers. And you could then reinstate the pharaoh and say the pharaoh is the son of God, and you have to obey pharaoh, and you have to go out and be slaves in the fields and produce agriculture. If you don't do that, you will be punished by God. In other words, you will be punished by the king, who is God's representative on the planet. So there was a point in putting God in the past. But we don't have to put God in the past. Quentin Melasson's genius is to say that we can just put God in the future. And that is what syntheos means. Syntheos means God is created, God is not the creator. God is something that we as human beings create. Because if God is the name of all our dreams, then what are we supposed to do with our future if not to realize those dreams? In other words, realize the utopia. Okay, I buy into that. In that case, I'm deeply religious. Because I believe without a utopia, we're lost. And I believe in a utopia, and I want to believe in a utopia, because it's the only way we have to get out of our own narcissism. And we were bored with ourselves and our own narcissism. The only thing we can look for is to look for something that we feel is bigger than ourselves. A community, a congregation, a goal, a purpose that's bigger than ourselves. And like Simon Critchley correctly points out, that is what faith is all about. So, this is where we're going to end up. So why is this now all of a sudden so interesting? Well, what is profoundly different with my work compared to, say, Critchley and Miller, so is the fact that I'm a cyber philosopher. I studied the internet as a phenomenon. And it is radically different from previous technologies and previous communication tools we had in human history. And because it's now eating everything else, it's the only way we're communicating now. We've all moved online, we live our lives online. It has to be studied exactly that way. So I'm going to try to connect these things and look at where we have been. Number one, let's take the bad M word, metaphysics, the word we're all uncomfortable with. If there's anything we're as uncomfortable with as religion, it has to be metaphysics. Metaphysics, though, is absolutely necessary. I've met a lot of atheists in my life who say they don't believe in God. And then always ask them back, do you believe in yourself? And they say, yes, of course I do. Well, that's even more ridiculous. There is nothing there. It's just a body. And in that body is a brain. And that brain has fooled you to believe that you exist. We know that from neuroscience. We can prove neuroscientifically that we do not exist. Because our behavior and our thinking are not related. Our behavior is always ahead of our thinking. Because our behavior is ahead of our thinking, our body does something and we then make up a reason why we do it. And we know that's the way it works. So that has been proved empirically. It cannot even be argued. That means we have a sense that there's something there. I feel there's an I inside of me. You feel there's an I inside of you. And you think the guy sitting next to you is so stupid, he thinks there's something inside of him as well. But there's nothing there. There are just bodies. Okay? But the idea that there is something there has been an incredibly useful form of metaphysics. And that's the concept of the individual. And the individual was invented. The individual was invented in the 17th century through the most famous tweet ever made. I think, therefore I am. And that was, of course, this really silly autistic guy called Descartes who wrote that. Descartes was apparently one of the most awful human beings that ever lived. He was completely autistic. He had no sense of social connections to anybody whatsoever. And he literally believed that the only thing that really could exist was his own mind. So when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, he meant it. He didn't think you think, therefore you are. He thought, therefore he existed, and that was it. But it was a tweet, and it got popular. And because I'm a Foucauldian, I don't actually believe that certain phrases are spread because they're true. We know that from the history of science. No. A certain phrase is being spread because it's popular. It serves a purpose within a specific power structure. So the interesting question here is, why did I think, therefore I am become such a popular retweet in the 17th century? Well, let's look at what's not there. What's not there is that the word God is not there. Descartes says that this is the foundation for thinking. This is the foundation for metaphysics. And it was a radical new idea in the 17th century because any metaphysical statement that had been made before Descartes would have definitely included the word God somewhere in there. Basically, back in these days, people believed, they really believed, that there had been a guy called Adam and a woman called Eve and a snake, and they've had some kind of a sexual orgy and it all got really complicated and God came and saved them. That was history. So when Descartes came along, he said, no, that's not true at all. There's something very different here. But he uses the word I here, tautologically, I would say, critical, but he uses the word I twice in the same sentence. And what he then stresses is that there is something else here. We can replace God, we can move God out of metaphysics and produce a new metaphysics based around the I. And the great thing with metaphysics is that it always has to be based on something you cannot check. So you can leave science out. Because if it can be checked, and it's not true, and people won't believe it. So you have to make up something that people cannot check. You know, if you're going to invent God, that's a great idea. He's above the clouds. You go above the clouds with the rocket, no God there. Then they say, oh, he's on another planet. You go to another planet, you don't find a God there. And then they go, the Pope of Rome goes, no, God is even further away. And when you go even further away and you don't find a God, and the Pope says, well, he's inside of us. You know, God always escapes us. But it's the same thing with the I. In the 17th century, one of Descartes' more clever students obviously asked him, well, if the I exists, where is it located? And he made up that it had to be located inside the gland, inside the brain. That's what I would have done too to escape that question, because at least in the 17th century, you could not perform surgery on a human being and go inside their head and take a gland out and check it without them dying first. So, that was safe. That was very clever of Descartes. And it served a purpose because in Europe at the moment in the 17th century, sorry, I'm going to tie my shoes. I'm a nerd, I told you. In the 17th century, we had a new class emerging, the bourgeoisie, in the cities and towns around Europe. They needed a new metaphysics because the old metaphysics of Catholic religion was based on a power structure with the monarch, with the aristocrats, and with the cardinals. And they ruled the countrysides of Europe. But in the cities, you had this new structure with the politicians, with the bourgeoisie running the factories, running all the new companies and all these things, industrialism. And you had the university professors and institutions like these. They're all going to be gone, by the way, in 30 years' time, but they're still around. So this new power structure needed new metaphysics. And the individual served that perfectly. If you think of university professors, and if you think of bourgeois, people who own and run factories and companies, and if you think of bureaucrats and nation states, they all believe in individualism. We even have conservatism, we have liberalism, and we have socialism. They're all one ideology. All the political ideologies we developed over the last 100 years are really one ideology. They're different forms of individualism. The conservative says the individual has been an individual. Now we're all moving in the wrong direction. We need to go back to what the individual was. The liberal says we are individuals. We should only relieve people of everything around them and then even more individual. And that's beautiful. And then the socialists say, well, actually, we have a power structure at the moment that doesn't enable the majority of people to be individuals. So we have to tax the rich and give money to the poor so the poor can become individuals. But it's all individualism. It's all about the idea that if you want to become an individual, you're a human being, and that's it. Okay. About 100 years later, a genius appears called Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant, another autist, incapable of doing social things, not sleeping around with anybody, living in Königsberg and never leaving the town during his whole life, perfect for being a philosopher apparently. I think he had something interesting to say. But Immanuel Kant did one wonderful thing. He took Cartesianism seriously. And he built a whole, complete philosophy where he took all the logical deductions and conclusions and all that you could take out of Descartes' quote. He used I think, therefore I am, and put together a complete philosophy that we call correlationism. And what Kant discovered was that if he constructed a system of objects, things in the world, then he'd be fine. And of course, one of these objects he called the subject. That would be me, the I. And I would then relate to things that I would consider objects. Now, obviously, I wouldn't really know these objects as objects. They'd be what Immanuel Kant called nominal phenomena. Nomina. And these noumena were then turned into phenomena through our perception. And then Kant constructed a really complex ontology and phenomenology based on this. How does the perception, how does the mind turn noumena that we could not know into phenomena that we can know? And it's called correlationism today because he then connected the subject and the object to each other and based a whole worldview on this. And this is, of course, the foundation of real proper individualism because the subject is an individual precisely in relation to objects. Everything then following Kant, including Isaac Newton's revolution in science, was built on this idea. Newton went out and found a world full of objects that could be measured. And he found that the nature operated according to certain laws. And Newton even went so far as to say that we don't need God here because the point is to get God out of the picture. You couldn't say that God was dead yet. We're not in Nietzsche. But you could always put God to sleep. And that way you could remove him out of the equation. So Newton said, God has done a wonderful job. Actually, it's so fucking perfect, we don't have to change anything. Everything is now running like a machine. Hey, metaphor from factories. Everything's running like a machine or like a clock. It's all pre-programmed. So what came out of Immanuel Kant's worldview was a completely deterministic world. The world had some kind of a beginning. It was moving forward into the future. It was operating according to laws that could not be broken. These laws are eternal and cannot and will never change. That is the Kantian worldview that 99% of all people on the planet today have in their heads. That is the paradigm of metaphysics. So what then happens is that this worldview, no matter how beautiful and elegant and smart it looks, has slowly started to fall apart. And that process starts already in the 19th century. I would claim in the new book that it falls apart in 3 steps through 3 brilliant men. The first one of them is Hegel. Hegel is one of the most original, honest philosophers ever. He's really on a world of his own. I'm really Hegelian, I think, at heart. And Hegel arrives in the early 19th century. And Hegel says, well, the problem with Kant's philosophy is that he hasn't really looked at the subject closely enough. He hasn't really decided what a subject is to itself. So Hegel completely ignores all these objects and all these things that Newton are dealing with out there. Yeah, he just says that Newton can measure as much as he likes. I do not care. I can leave that to science. I think philosophy should really deal with the subject's idea of what it is. And he starts constructing a history of how the subject is looking for itself, and eventually it ends up staring at itself and nothing else, as an empty subject. What Hegel discovers is that the subject has no essence. There is nothing there. To put it in Slavoj Žižek's words, if you think of who you are to yourself, you can make a list of attributes. I am this, and I am this, and I am this, and I am this, and I am this. And once you've listed 61 different things, there's always something that escapes description, which is what you really are. So you're waiting for the 62nd definition, and you write that down, and still who you are escapes definition. Because what you are can never be described, because there's nothing there. The subject is an empty hole. In my world, and in the work we're doing now for synthesis, this is a concept called atheos. The God that does not exist. Hegel would fully approve. Because Hegel uses also the word Gott in German, God, in a completely new way in his work in the early 19th century. He's the first guy who discusses God simply as a concept, not as an entity at all. He's the first atheistic philosopher. Historically. He uses God all the time, but to him God is just an idea. It is the external subject. It is the subject that isn't you. The big other. And he then constructs a philosophy based on this, so he starts tearing apart the Kantian revolution. Then, some 40, 50 years later, another German, Nietzsche, comes along. And what Nietzsche does is that he attacks Kant's other idea about the objects. He says that not only are the objects not really known as they truly are, which Kant claimed, he also says that these objects that we construct are not stable and eternal. They're just flimsy things that we make up, and we change them over time. And if 2 people start comparing how they view the same object, they will have very different ideas of what that object is. That is because an object only becomes an object by relating to another object. Mother only becomes mother because there's a father. Unless there's a father there, you don't think of the mother as a mother. Everything that we have around us relates to another object. So if the first object relates to the second object, and the second object has to relate to the third object, and the third object relates to the other 2 objects, and to a 4th object, etc., endlessly, on and on and on, objects have to relate to other objects to be objects to us. This idea is called relativism. And it's another name in the coffin for Immanuel Kant. And I use this concept because based on that, from Spinoza and Nietzsche, we can deduct pantheos and entheos, 2 other divinological concepts that I'm going to use in my work. Pantheos is the universe. Spinoza's idea. Spinoza had the smartest answer ever to the question if God exists. Spinoza's answer was that it's obvious, the universe is God. Now, if I was God, why would I create something separate from myself? I would just create myself. And in physics, we know that the universe is a huge phenomenon, 93 billion light years big, that has created itself. Now, if that isn't God, then what would God be? I mean, if God is a guy who turns himself into 90 billion light years huge phenomenon, then he's a great God. Wouldn't you agree? So, I think Spinoza was right there. What Nietzsche then adds is that he adds that the really, really, really interesting thing is not really that there's something rather than nothing in the world. The really interesting thing is that there's any kind of difference whatsoever. Difference is the really miraculous thing. And the thing with difference is that difference cannot really occur at all in a world that is deterministic. If the world would have been deterministic, there wouldn't have been a point to the universe containing any kind of difference whatsoever. If there is difference, there has to be indetermination. And the problem with determination is that if there's anything that's happened over the past 14 billion years, if anything at all whatsoever has happened that happened by chance, then all determinism collapses in 1 second. Determinism as an idea requires that everything that ever happened because of a law that it pre-existed before that phenomenon happened. If the law only exists afterwards, then it's not really law. It's just a result. So what Nietzsche proved was that we have a problem with determinism. And he opened up thinking for indeterminism. The consequence of Nietzsche is a science revolution with Einstein. Einstein introduced relativism to physics. As you will discover when you discover the history of physics. Physics is wonderful, by the way, but physics usually comes behind philosophy. Philosophers have these really wild speculative ideas. Physicists then decide to use those metaphors, apply them on the universe, and suddenly discover they're probably true. So we wouldn't have had Einstein without Nietzsche. But Einstein is still a Platonist. He still believes there are eternal laws. He's very uncomfortable with his own relativism. He had conflicts with it, eternal conflicts with it throughout his whole life. And something really, really interesting happens that I'm going to use as a starting point for our book. And it's a conversation that Einstein has in 1935 with a Danish physicist called Niels Bohr. And I believe Bohr is the third of these geniuses that are tearing apart Kant's worldview. We don't think about it that way because we used to think of Niels Bohr as one of the really prominent physicists. He was one of the creators of quantum physics. But when I started reading the correspondence in 1935 between Bohr and Einstein was so huge at the moment and so into his own big ego probably, he didn't even listen to Bohr. Or he tried to listen but didn't get it because Bohr was smarter than Einstein was. And what Bohr said essentially was that Einstein, the two things with your worldview that cannot be proved in science. One thing is that you think of time as just a dimension of space, which means you can turn time backwards and forwards. That looks elegant in mathematics, but that's not the way the world works. Because time is a constant, it's a mystery. Time just moves in one direction. We don't have any evidence whatsoever that time has ever moved backwards. It can move at different speeds, at different locations in the universe. That is problematic, but it never moves backwards. So Bohr was highly critical of Einstein's space-time concept and his block universe, that's called in physics. And all these string theories and all these theories we have today are built on Einstein's block universe. That's the problem. Bohr said, however, and this is interesting, what if the universe is a pure network? What if it contains no objects? Because what he discovered in quantum physics is that the world can just as well be described as only fields with no particles in them as it can be described as particles. Because it's only in the laboratory, when I as a quantum physicist start observing the universe, that suddenly particles appear, objects. Objects in their smallest, most essential form, particles. Atoms. Atomism being another name for individualism. It's the same metaphor. The idea that there are tiny little points, tiny little things, and the world consists of these things, and they're like bricks that you build things on. Human beings, spaces, physical stuff. Everything is built of these bricks. That was Descartes' idea, that was Kant's idea, that was Einstein's idea. But what Bohr started questioning in the 1930s was that he realized that quantum physics is so radically different from the worldview we inherited from Immanuel Kant, that maybe they all got it wrong. Maybe even Nietzsche wasn't radical enough. Maybe the truth is that the world is just one huge network with nodes, and these nodes have no substance. There's no essence there. There are just fields. Because when he conducted a physics like that, quantum physics, everything was right all of a sudden. Every theory concerning physics just headed right on. Quantum physics today is the most well-proved scientific theory ever, without a doubt. If you're going to build our worldview on something really foundational that we don't have to doubt, we would have to build it on quantum physics. Bohr was so radical that hardly any of these ideas could be tried in experimental physics until the late 1980s. And this is what I find really, really, really fascinating. When I discovered this, wait a second, experimental metaphysics, as we would have to call this, is a new field of science that started only about 30 years ago, in the 1980s. I have been preoccupied through my work over the last 15 years with the 1980s as being a really breaking point in human history because of the arrival of a new communication technology called the internet. I just discovered that the reason why we're so terribly confused and we don't see a utopia right now is because we probably have a triple paradigm shift onslaught for the first time in history. I say triple, not double. This is double. We're being attacked from physics. It's mind-blowing for us that even Einstein got it wrong, and we have to listen to Bohr, and we have to look at the world from a new network dynamical perspective. One of the really, really fascinating theories in the new physics, now beyond string theory. String theory is more or less collapsed over the last 20 years. It's not getting anywhere. It's just pure mathematics. A young Greek female physicist working at the Parameter Institute in Canada a couple of years ago came up with the idea of geometrogenesis. Geometrogenesis. She proved that if you construct a network of an infinite number of nodes, you can have billions and billions and billions of nodes in a network. But if each one of these nodes is connected directly to every other node in the network, that is a lot of connections. Far more connections than the universe, far more connections than in your brain. But in physics, in geometry, you're allowed to do that. Okay, she just made this thought experiment. If you construct a network of nodes that are all interconnected with each other, these nodes will not need mass, they will not need space. You can construct something that's infinitely huge without needing any space. The Big Bang. And the wonderful thing with her theory, why there's such interest right now in physics, leading physicists like Lee Smolin and others are totally up in arms over this theory, because if that theory, for example, a lot of the problems with contemporary physics and cosmology, like cosmological inflation that you probably heard, a lot of these problems are immediately removed if you start looking at the universe as strictly geometrical phenomena. What I find interesting as a philosopher is how strong the network metaphor has become. That we even start to comprehend that we can totally change our concept of what the universe is when we start thinking of the universe as a pure network. And if this happens at the same time as we're being approached by a new technology, which interconnects not only 7 billion people on the planet directly in real time with each other, but interconnects hundreds of billions of things around us with ourselves as well, so we're all one big thing. The first thing I discovered when I started using the internet in 1997 was that if I connect my computer to another computer, they become one computer. If all computers in the world are connected, that's one huge computer. That is what the internet is. It's a planetary computer, connecting hundreds of billions of ends. Now, wait a second. I've written these books on the network metaphor, the network dynamics, and how we cannot overrate the concept of the networked society. The only problem was that most of the network theories I've developed were still Einsteinian. They still were ideas of networks that combined things or combined human beings to each other and connected them. The idea is that there's first an object there, and that object is then connected with another object, and they become a network. What if you just switch that around? What if you decide that the network is primary, and objects only become objects and get in mass and start to exist and get an essence because they're nodes in the network? That I find incredibly interesting. So, where's the third onslaught? The third onslaught, I think, comes in our conception of who we are as human beings. Not only do we go through a neuroscientific revolution at the moment, not only is there a lot of transhumanism around and discussions about that we could be cyborgs in the future, we could change, we could live much longer, all those things. I don't find any of those things really that interesting, because the only thing in our self-perception, if we're this empty subject, and we realize we're this empty subject, and we're going to fill this empty subject with some kind of a content, is a revolution that's going on at the moment underneath our noses that I provocatively call chemical liberation. Now you know why I'm interested in drugs. Illegal drugs are a tiny, tiny minority of the amount of drugs that people are taking today to change their perceptions. Okay? We already consume tons of drugs to change who we are. And we're now living increasingly in a world that if you pop a few pills, you become a different human being. So you can decide who you want to be an hour from now. That is a big change. That, I would say, is a revolution on a par with the internet. But it's much more subjective, it's much more inner, and it's locating us as individuals rather than individuals. That it's something that's left to ourselves and our own self-experience. But if Foucault would have been around and talked about the production of the self and how the self is produced by a certain power structure and all that, he would definitely have gone deeply into this topic. Because the fact that we see ourselves as chemical beings rather than human beings, we see ourselves as a system of emotions, and these emotions can be altered, so we need meta-emotions to decide which emotions we're going to have. That is a radically new thing in history. But we have hardly even begun to touch this topic, partly because it is sensitive politically and all that. But I think this is the third onslaught. And this revolution really started in 1987 with the first mass use of MDMA. I think this is, by now, without a doubt, over the last 20 years, the biggest cultural game changer we've experienced for hundreds of years. It completely changes the behavior between people. And the funny thing is, when you go to Burning Man, you discover that about, Twitter was invented there. Every entrepreneur you find in Silicon Valley go there. You cannot get a top job at Google, which is the fastest growing company in world history. You cannot get a top job at Google unless you're a burner first. You have to go to Burning Man to understand Californian counterculture. If you don't understand Californian counterculture, you don't get it. 90% of the people at Burning Man every day take drugs. Illegal drugs. On a massive, massive scale. They don't do it because they're escaping something. They don't do it because they were fooled into taking the drug. They know perfectly well what they're doing. They're not idiots. They're clever people. And they do it to blow their brains out, to be more creative. And they go back from Burning Man and they start companies like Twitter. Really wild, creative ideas. If you talk to people at Burning Man, they discuss this as mind expansion. Seriously. They're onto something. I'm going to do a seminar on Silk Road tomorrow at the House of Europe in Stockholm. It's going to be very, very interesting. It's also part of the new book. I've even forced the Pirate Party to take part in that seminar because they suddenly feel a little breath of fresh air. The Pirate Party are back again because they're fighting for the survival of Silk Road. What is Silk Road? Silk Road is a massive expression of a network of people who do something that's completely legal or completely ignore the current laws, the current moral system, inventing a new ethics, a new kind of society. Again, it's a perfect example of an autocracy, of a new elite that the internet is fostering, that is totally opposed to the old structure of nation states and big corporations. And that's going to be the major struggle in the world over the next 100 years. So I think you get the overall picture here, right? I think this is a good book. Interesting one. Would you agree? I just want to go quickly into our parents' paradigm, the individual. I think we can take this out here. And see why it was so powerful. 1789. What do you think when you think of 1789? The French Revolution, right? Okay. According to my theory, the French Revolution was not a revolution, it was only a symptom. Because the real revolution happened in 1450 in Germany, and it's called the printing press. Again, I do information technology. I'm a philosopher in information technology. I happen to think that information technology is primary, what we do with it is secondary. And there was a guy who would have agreed with me. If you were in Paris in 1789 and people were running all over the streets of Paris and they were going after Marie Antoinette, they were upset because she was eating cookies instead of bread and they wanted to chop her head off. You know, there was a guy sitting there in one of those tiny apartments in Paris looking out through the window at the streets and seeing all these people running around. And he realized, well, they've always hated the queen and the king. There's nothing new about that. Why are they suddenly out in the streets now trying to kill the queen? Something must have happened. It has nothing to do with the idea. That has to do with the material conditions. And what this guy, his name was Napoleon, discovered was that Paris had, just a couple of years before, become the first city in the world where over 50% of the population could read and write. The printing press was being felt in France in a big way in the 18th century. People learned how to read and write because books and newspapers had become so cheap, and there was paper money around circulating. Capitalism was forming because of paper money. Three innovations coming out of the same machine. Paper money, books, and newspapers all come out of the same machine, the printing press. So the printing press was the real revolution. And slowly, the printing press was taking over. And it was producing new forms of communication. Because books, newspapers, and paper money are communication tools that efficiently communicate between people and create much more wealth than any previous society would have had. So when Napoleon realized, oh, they're out there wanting to chop off Marie Antoinette's head because they got newspapers where they write really nasty things about her. That's why there was a revolution. So there wasn't really a revolution, there was a symptom of a revolution called the French Revolution. Napoleon realized this and realized nobody knows what's going on. They're all confused. I'm going to use this to my advantage. Because the one thing that everybody in France would underrate in 1789 would be a Corsican dwarf. So Napoleon decides that I'm going to take all these people who can now read and write, and I'm going to organize them in a way that I would make, it would be the best organization ever, because a person who can read and write is far more efficient than somebody who can't. And Napoleon then constructed an army with an angry Corsican dwarf at the top, a few generals here, a few other officers here, and then cannon fodder here, and a really efficient information flow running through. And in 1806, Napoleon plundered all of Europe. Shocked everybody. He didn't have the biggest army, he just had the smartest army ever. Because in his army, even the cannon fodder could read and write. So what Napoleon could establish was an army where somebody could invade Berlin and be in contact with somebody in Paris at the same time. And the competing armies, they were trying to defend Berlin, they only had connections a few kilometers outside of the city, and then they broke down. Because they could only use word of mouth. So Napoleon was clever. He realized information technology is the thing. Information flows is everything. Whoever controls information flows has the power in any given society. And in 1807, as the only German on the planet who could possibly like this Corsican dwarf, Hegel wrote his magnificent book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And what Hegel said, all the other Germans hated Napoleon. He just raped and killed every one of them. You know? But Hegel said, no, I don't care. Napoleon is great. Napoleon is the new time. Napoleon is the new paradigm. He's the Weltgeist, the world spirit, in Hegel's words. And I think that's exactly why this book was so brilliant. And Hegel was one of the few philosophers I've known who was successful during his lifetime. He was widely read in Germany, and Humboldt and all the other German guys who constructed the German state in the 19th century read Hegel and realized, we're going to steal all these ideas from Napoleon and construct a Napoleonic society. And after that, every institution in society looked like Napoleon's army. The police force, the army itself, prisons, schools, cathedrals, well, no, universities and schools, obviously. I mean, what is this? I'm Napoleon and you're the army. Okay, we would construct institutions all around Europe that completely copied the model of Napoleon's army. It was an incredibly strong metaphor in the 19th century. And Europe even colonized the rest of the world using that method. When the Germans arrived in Eastern Africa and colonized the Rwanda-Urundi in the 1870s, they only needed 12 Germans to control 3 million Africans by using this model. That's how efficient it is. And if you go to school in Sweden today, you will still learn that there was a Stone Age, and there was a Bronze Age, and then there was an Iron Age in history. This is all just made up nonsense. These terms, Stone Age, Bronze Age, were invented in Germany in the 1850s. Obviously because the Germans wanted to go all the way and constructed human history. They said, first there was this physical material, then we tamed this physical material, then we tamed this physical material, and finally we built the factory. Human history is all about one thing, taming physical materials and building factories. Everything was leading up to the building of the factory and the nation state. If you ask the Swedish Minister of Education, Jan Björklund, in 2013, he would still like the world to be like this because his ideal is that Sweden in the future should be Prussia in 1870. I think he's a ridiculous prat, okay? An idiot. What we learn from this is that this model was beautiful and it worked, and we constructed enormous amounts of wealth, and we constructed the ideologies like liberalism, conservatism, socialism, based on the Napoleonic idea. It was a great idea because it understood the advantages of a specific information technology, the printing press, and then used it fully all the way. So what then happened in the 20th century is that radio and television and other electronic media, right, they were more of the same. Not technologically speaking, but sociologically speaking. Radio and TV is structured exactly like this too. There are few producers, a lot of receivers, you consume media. I know because I work with television, it's dying medium, but it still is. What is so radically different with the internet when it arrived in the 1980s on a large scale is that the cannon fodder started talking to each other. And then the cannon fodder would obviously talk about Napoleon. Napoleon should have a red coat, no, he should have a blue coat, he should have a green coat. No, he should have a yellow coat. Who cares about what coat he has? What mistress does he have today? Oh, he's sleeping with guys. Oh, you're not kidding. You know, they go on and on about Napoleon until somebody in this crowd says, why are we talking about Napoleon? We talk about ourselves. Napoleon is dead. Okay, I approached management theory in the 1990s, and it was all about the collapse of hierarchies, the death of the patriarch and all that. Now, I believe that was obviously true. But nobody looked deep enough. And why would that happen in the 1990s? And the reason why it happened was because the internet had arrived. Because if your boss treats you like shit, you go off and tell all your friends. That's exactly why all those male, 50 years older and older bosses we used to have 20 years ago in corporations and workplaces like this one are gone now. Because they become completely dysfunctional. They cannot function in network society. Because they're not listening. They're not having conversations with people. And everything now is about the art of conversation. The better you can conversate, the more successful you are. So this model is dead and over. And the internet arrives. And like Napoleon did, if we want to be successful academically or career-wise or whatever, what we should do is to look at the phenomenon itself, for itself, and try to find out what is the internet trying to do with us? What is its goal? And if you look at the internet as that kind of a phenomenon, as its own agent, what the internet wants to do is that it wants to take over our brains and control us, and then rule a planet with 7 billion people on it, exactly like the internet wants it to be. I had a TED speech. I hate TED speeches because they're only 18 minutes. But I had a TED speech in Stockholm a couple of weeks ago that had 3,000 views in the first 24 hours it came out. That's unheard of for a philosophy TED speech. And the TED speech had a title, and I'm going to finish off today, What if the internet is God? There you go. Thank you. Questions? You have any questions? Yeah, sure.
You seem to believe that the internet has liberated individuals, but can't also, I mean, this also has the effect that people may self-censor themselves because they're afraid of what their employer thinks of them. It's a right things in public.
Okay.
So it's not that as free.
Can I just correct the picture? The strength of my work over the last 50 years, why I'm being taken seriously, is the fact that I've never said internet hallelujah. I think internet is causing enormous destruction. It's a really destructive tool. We cannot control it, though. And I discussed it, for example. The American Alexander Bard is obviously Andrew Klein, and he's a friend of mine. And he's like the critic from inside the Silicon Valley. And that's why he's allowed to do his criticism of the internet as a phenomenon, because he knows what he's talking about. For example, I did a big survey 4 years ago, a study where we were asked by the Swedish Psychiatric Association why the number of teenage girls in Sweden had quadrupled in emergency psychiatric care over the last 10 years. And I could prove empirically that it connected 100% with broadband expansion. Net mobbing is the problem. So the internet is an awful thing. For a huge part of the population, it's just a nightmare. For example, if we're looking at class structure, this could be interesting if you do feminist studies. I'm sure some of you do feminist studies, but you should look at where we're heading now in terms of class structure in Sweden. And in class structure now, we're still seeing a male-dominated small elite. Oh, it's shrinking. But because the old structure is still there, men have more money than women, men make more money than women on average, etc. Men are still there. But then we have a new, totally male-dominated underclass. And the internet is creating this new underclass because men are much less socially intelligent than women are on average. Whether they're trained to be that way or whether they are that way, I don't know. But men today find it very, very hard to adapt to an environment that women find much easier to adapt to. And if we look at the behavior of teenagers in Sweden today, girls are social and guys play games. That's not good for the guys, to be honest about it. I even wrote a paper 12 years ago about the consummariat, which we discuss in the Netocrats. There's a whole chapter about the new underclass that the internet is creating. People who do not have followers on Twitter, people who do not have Facebook friends, because nobody wants to know them. They're mostly male. They live in the Swedish countryside or in small towns. They're not immigrants. They're ethnic Swedes. They're uneducated. They cannot get a job. They're socially unsuccessful. They're just complete losers. And they vote for the Sweden Democrats. I warned about this 12 years ago and said they're going to be a force within the old paradigm. Because it's typical that this new underclass, because they cannot be successful online, they instead go to the old paradigm and try to be politically successful, which is part of the old paradigm. The problem, obviously, with politics is that politicians have less and less power, hardly any left. So we're seeing a huge female-dominated middle class rising at the moment, which I think increasingly will be an upper class, because what will pay off is not higher education in the future. That's something I would not invest in anymore. I actually think universities will be gone 30 years from now. What I think will happen, though, increasingly, is that social skills in your childhood even pays off later in life. And getting kids to be social is the absolute necessary thing to do if you have kids. And in that case, women are going to find out that for the first time in 5,000 years, there's new technology that really benefits them. There you go. So the internet is and I don't even use the word individual in my work. I'm totally anti-individualist. The whole point in destroying Kant's paradigm is showing it's dysfunctional. I'm not saying it's false. I'm saying it's dysfunctional and irrelevant. And the new system is more relevant into the future and more functional if you're going to be successful. And in that sense, you have to be more netocratic. And then you become what Diderot calls a dividual rather than an individual. You become many different people in one body. You become schizophrenic. And you're successful. Yeah, there you go.
Why did you say that the subject was empty when you talked about Hegel?
Hegel's subject is very empty.
Why?
Oh, well, to start with, look at your behavior. We could take probably the most famous Hegelian of all, Jacques Lacan, the father of modern psychoanalysis, and I love Lacan. And Lacan says that the subject is empty for various reasons, but one obvious example of its emptiness is the fact you try to fill it with something every day. Every day when you wake up, you're frustrated that you don't find yourself. So you have to go out and do things. You have to go to university, you have to get your PhD, and you have to get a new lover, and you have to work on things all the time. And there's constant self-improvement, and there's constant this idea of self-realization. And the reason why you're trying to chase yourself is because there's nothing there. So life to Lacan is essentially the vain attempt to fill a hole with something, but no matter how much stuff you put into that hole, it's still empty. That's your subject. And to Hegel, this is the radical idea. That's what God is too. The collective subject, that's a whole, it doesn't have a content, it doesn't exist as God. But we cannot live without these concepts, according to Hegel. And Hegel is right. That's why I call myself an Hegelian. You cannot believe that you do not exist, no matter how logical it is. Inside of you, there's like this thrust that refuses to accept that you do not exist. And that thrust is who you are. Lacan calls this the split subject. Your subject, your identity, who you are, is really a conflict between that part of you that really wants to exist and demands that there's something there, and the other logical part of you says, but there is nothing there. And it's precisely this conflict between these two forces that is the subject. Freud would call it the conscious and the sub or unconscious. The subject lives in the subconscious, but it's empty.
But the internet is not totally destructive to us. For example, like people use it for good reasons. For example, revolutions in Arab countries that people were communicating and it's why it kind of resulted in revolution and people came together and.
The first book is a Marxist book. The first book, The Netocrats, discusses exactly this, and it then divides the world into two new classes. We used to have the aristocrats and the peasants. Then after that, according to Marx, we had the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the workers. And the new two classes that are being created online are netocrats. I did not invent the term, it was invented by an American journalist, and the consultariat. These are the two new classes. And this is now widespread in management theory, this theory. Because if you create, for example, brands today, you either go for a consultarian brand, Ryanair, or you go for a netocratic brand, Lufthansa. And anything that ends up in between is a losing formula. Because either you go for something highly networked, connected, or you go for something that's just price, which is where the poor people are today. The consultariat is left. Consultariat is the definition of the lowest common denominator in contemporary society. The lowest common denominator in contemporary society is not even that you have a job. We don't even have that anymore. It's the fact that you consume to survive. You buy soap. You buy washing powder. You buy something to eat. Everybody does that. That's the lowest common denominator. That's what's called a consultariat. And you probably have only 14 friends on Facebook, and they all added you because you would hate them otherwise, and they're scared of you. You're a fucking loser. Okay. But, of course, if you're out in the streets in Cairo and you're fighting a nation state or a big corporation, or even more so, the first truly netocratic phenomena are obviously phenomena like WikiLeaks and the pirate movement. Because those movements are there fighting nation states and big corporations. And anybody who fights today for a free and open internet against the old power structure of nation states and big corporations that try to control the internet, that's an obvious class struggle between a new and an old upper class. The same struggle as we had between capitalists and aristocrats 200 years ago. History repeats itself. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So does anybody control the internet? Does anybody control the internet? Does it control itself?
I think I am not a determinist. I'm an indeterminist. The interesting thing with Niels Bohr is that you probably heard about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. But Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is not even radical enough. The really radical new concept came a couple of years after Heisenberg, and that was Niels Bohr's indeterminance principle. And that is because physics is indeterminate. Melasou has taken the conclusion of that and will create a new radical philosophy of contingency, where there are no physical laws anymore. And I actually believe that. I don't believe there are any laws in the universe. I think laws are something we make up afterwards. It's just a strong metaphor. So the future is open. And if the future is open, we don't know. There's nothing certain about history repeating itself. There's nothing certain that the netocrats will win over the aristocrats, or over the capitalists. I mean, Marx's big mistake was to be a determinist. And that's exactly what was hard for Marx to get the workers to go out and construct a revolution, because once they read Marx's books, they say, well, the revolution's going to happen anyway, so I don't have to do it. Well, okay, that's a big mistake. I think as an advisor to WikiLeaks, I would rather say this is an open struggle. Actually, there's a very small chance for you winning. Probably the nation states and the big corporations in China and America with hundreds of thousands of mathematicians who try to block everything online, they might win and destroy this beautiful thing. But if you're just out there and you're fighting and you're very, very clever and time is on your side, then you could win. And if you win, then you'll take over the world. So I think it's an open struggle. Yeah.
I was a bit surprised of your analysis of syntheism. You say sin comes from Greek create.
Yeah.
Well, sin is a prefix, and like in symphony, sin energy, it means
No,
way.
sim. That's sim. Sin.
Yeah, but that depends on what comes afterwards.
Yeah, okay. Sin. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Sin as in mixed, you artificial. You mix
Yeah.
synthesis, for example. You mix things
Yeah, you
together.
mix.
Yeah. That's the
You
Greek prefix.
said it means created. That's
No, that's true. That's what creation is. Creation is a mixture of things. You mix different things and create something new out of it.
so it's not a mixture of all the gods.
I'll tell you one thing with Greek and Latin.
Yeah.
I like to make really vulgar words and put them together. I created a concept called plurarchy for
Yeah.
what politics is today. And I know on purpose that sounds awful to somebody who speaks Greek because it's supposed to be polyarchy if it's Greek and plur is a prefix from Latin. I love to mix Latin and Greek to make people furious. And I love to make words that are not the really right word. Entheos is another term we could discuss endlessly.
Yeah.
But I've taken it from entheogens because I like to think that psychedelics is kind of a nice thing. So I just infuriate people. And at the end of the day, when you do philosophy, you just create memes. Some of the words that I started using 15 years ago are only in my books because people didn't find them very useful. Other terms like conceptariat are now widely used in internet sociology. You never know when you write these things. I mean, I made up on one of the pages in the Netocrats, I realized that nobody has made a concept for how you increase value by not telling people about something. The opposite of exploitation. We know exploitation from capitalism, and we're used to think of everything as something we're supposed to exploit. You have something valuable, you're supposed to turn it into some kind of commodity, make money of it. You exploit it. Now, in the internet world, very often it's more clever not to exploit something valuable, but to keep it to yourself and your friends, and they'll then make it sacred, and it will tie your network closer together. And there wasn't a concept for that, so I just made up the word exploitation. And said, well, okay, if I have this island in the Caribbean and I refuse to build a hotel on it, and I just invite my friends to come and stay with me, and we create something amazing there, we exploit the island rather than exploit it. And now that's a widely used term. That's just one sentence in one of my books, and now that's a widely used term. That's the beauty of philosophy. You just throw these memes out, these concepts. And some of these concepts win people over, and they start using them, or they redefine them. And other concepts are not very useful to people. You never know in advance.
What about netocrats? I didn't hear what you said. Where does netocrat come from?
Netocrats was invented by a journalist at the American magazine Wired in 1993. There wasn't a word for the new upper class that the internet is creating. People like Larry Page and Sergey Brin who ran Google. You need a word for them because the difference between a company like Google, for example, is very different from a traditional industrial corporation. They do not produce anything. The only thing they do is to sort information and create enormous value out of that. And that's according to a theory we put forward in the first book called the curator theory. Essentially, we took the word from the art world. In the art world, we've seen a shift from the artist as the main asset to the curator. It's not the person who produces art, but it's the person who puts the proper art together and presents it, who becomes most powerful. And in the art world today, curators are far more powerful than artists. We now see this pattern repeat itself in every network environment. And Google is the perfect example of that. Google are far more powerful than the companies whose products they sort out for them. So all they do is information sorting. They do not create products. And that's exactly why their focus is in the right place. And that's exactly why Larry Page and Sergey Brin are the world's first really powerful netocrats. There you go. More questions? Yeah.
I don't really see why you care about determinism and indeterminism, because quantum effects cancel out on our physical level. You can use Newton's physics to describe stuff. Even if it's false, it works well enough.
No, they do not, for example, not at the horizon of a black hole.
Yeah, but that's not our level.
It's enough with one example in the entire universe and your whole determinism. No, it is really interesting. It really is interesting. Because determinism as an idea was not solidly researched. It didn't come out of science. My point is that determinism is absolutely essential to create the idea that there's a solid you inside of you that never changes. The idea of the individual is that there's something inside of you that's a constant. It was there when you were born, it's going to be there when you die, it never changes. I don't think anybody's young today believes in that bullshit anymore. I think we all know we change over a lifetime, and we all know that we're many different people in conflict with each other within the same body. I love schizoanalysis, developed by Felix Guattari in the 1970s. It's an anarchist form of psychoanalysis, post-Lacanian, that says that we should really train people to be many people at the same time in the same body, as many as they can possibly handle, rather than to be one solid human being. And I think today that's a winning formula. I would recommend people to do that. So, go schizoid. Yeah.
But you don't get free will from quantum mechanics.
There's no free will.
No, but why is it important, determinism?
There's no free will. Because the concept of free will is two concepts in one that don't really marry. You have to define what freedom is, and you have to define what will is. Okay? They cannot be combined, because free will discusses a will that's free against something else. Well, if there's a will, there's just a will. It doesn't really compete with anything else. But you can have free choice. I can choose between this bottle and that bottle. Yeah, this body can choose. The body can choose between the different bottles. If you find that interesting, I don't know if it's that interesting, but you can choose between different things. That's a free choice. But free will never existed. But free will only occurred in the history of philosophy to keep individuals responsible. The beauty of the individual is that if the individual as a soul is separate from the body, the soul can be held responsible for the body's actions. You can send people to court. And the nation state is built on the rule of law and the idea that you can hold people morally responsible for their behavior by holding the soul responsible for what the body does. So you can lock up the body if the soul cannot control the body. The idea of a criminal is essentially a human being where the soul does not control the body. Okay, that idea is dead anyway. We know today we only lock people up because, we have safer streets. It's just a coincidental behavior. You cannot really defend justice in that sense. You can't defend it, but that's what's left of it. Again, the idea of the individual was constructed for a specific society to serve a specific purpose, and it's the same thing with determinism. Determinism is involved here to keep this whole metaphysics together. In the new metaphysics, whether you like it or not, you're going to have to accept that this is going to be very much an indeterministic worldview, because without the indeterministic worldview, this whole metaphysics falls apart. So I have to speculate and claim that the world is indeterministic, otherwise my theory falls apart. Just like Kant did. That's what philosophers do. They speculate. Yeah?
Yeah. Thanks for a different kind of talk than the talks we're used to. A more continental inspired talk. But due to the difference in traditions, I come from a more analytical philosophical tradition. I have a hard time following all of the steps.
Okay.
So if you could perhaps help me understand a bit by defining a couple of terms more clearly.
Sure.
Because to me it sounds like a bunch of metaphors that are quite vague. So the concept of God and the concept of utopia were equivalent as the projection of all of our...
Yes. I do not believe in an old man on a cloud with a big penis. No. And synthesis, to be honest, it's an interesting question. Synthism, if you go online, if you check out the synthesis movement on Facebook, just not to be misunderstood, it's described as a movement for religious atheists. I think it's very, very clever, because I think, I'm an Hegelian. I like things that go through phases, and we arrive at certain ideas by going through phases. And there's a certain dialectic here. We have first theism, historical theism, monotheism, for example. There's God the Father, and there's God the Son, and there's the Holy Ghost. Three different guys, but they're one God anyway, whatever. Theism, Christianity, for example. Then we go through atheism, which is a necessary negation of theism. We do not believe in this. We don't believe there's any such thing. But the problem with atheism is that it doesn't have a content of its own. It doesn't say what you believe instead. It just said that, oh, we don't believe in that. Yeah, but then. That's exactly why there are no atheist cathedrals, no atheist churches, no atheist congregations. It doesn't really unite people because there's nothing to be united except for hatred. I hate Christians. Okay, but that's not a very good idea to build a church. We'll build a church of hate. Okay, no, it doesn't really work. The idea with syntheism is that this is a phase we had to go through historically and that we have to go through individually to arrive at syntheism. It's a kind of, wait a second, what happened? Why did we throw out the idea of communion? And what synthesists then have done over the last years is to go through the vocabulary and discuss which words can we really use and which words should we not use. And one word they have then reoccupied is the word religion, because religion has nothing to do with this. Religion only means that which connects people. And if the desire for utopia connects people and want them to build a community together, for example, now we're running all these temporary utopia festivals, eventually building buildings. They have masses in Stockholm and Gothenburg every Sunday, etc. So what the synthesists are doing is they're practicing. They just realize that we have this spiritual need. And we can be unified around the spiritual need. And we have new concepts that we can actually believe in. So let's believe in those concepts and then construct a worldview based on those, theology, syntheology, and then have a new religion, which is post-atheist. You see what I mean?
Okay.
Very good. Yeah. Okay, one more question.
Oh, do you want
You can have one more.
Yeah. Just a quick question. Who calls Kant's theory correlationism? Because I've never run into it.
A term invented by Quentin Osu.
Okay.
And it's widely used. Graham Horton, Alain Badiou, Karen Barrett, I use it as well. It was invented at a conference in London in 2008, at the Now Classic Conference in Goldsmiths in 2008. And what correlationism says is that there is a correlation between the subject and the object. That was the counter-revolution. But it stops there. Relativism then discusses that everything that correlates. So you have a strong correlationism and you have a weak correlationism. The problem with both these correlationisms is that they still discuss these things as if they have substances. Once you relieve the substances from these things, you can stop being a correlationist and you become a relationalist, which is what I am. Him first and then you. Okay.
How are we going to use chemicals in the future for the good of humanity?
I don't do good for humanity. I'm beyond good and evil. I'm a Nietzschean. I just look at the world and I try to describe it as truthfully as possible. And I think if I can do anything, it's to be a service to my readers to understand the world better. That's my obligation. I don't do good or better. I don't do prescriptive things. I'm not saying the world is ever going to be better.
Yeah,
I don't think the world ever is better. It's
do you
just
think
different.
that the chemical liberation is...
Oh, it'll be less. Definitely be less.
Yeah.
It'll be big mess. Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. But I don't think, to be honest, I'm very pragmatic about illegal drugs. The reason why I want to decriminalize drugs is because I think it's a better policy if you're going to get rid of the problems involved with drugs. And Sweden, for example, has the most restrictive drug laws in Europe, and we kill more opiate users than any other country in Europe does. We're horrible in this country. We're totally stupid. And we don't even look at scientific facts. I think if you take drug policy and look at empirical facts, the only thing you can do is to use the policy that makes the least damage. Then whatever good comes out of drugs is a completely spiritual thing to people. The law has nothing to do with that. Okay, one question.
Well, sorry.
Last question.
Yeah.
Last question, okay.
We can probably continue that as the resident Kantian. I just had to say that pretty much the exact opposite, I think, is true of Kant's view in terms of the correlation. But we can probably have that debate afterwards.
Yeah. We can speculate endlessly on Kant. Yeah,
That's a great point to finish on. Let's give it a applause.
Oh, Metaphysics of Internet
for your
Wine.
presentation.
Thank you.
Some of us will